Hey everyone, this is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the intelligent social media platform. We have a very special treat tonight. A first time guest, Miss Figueroa, if I said it correctly.
Miss Figueroa.
Miss Figueroa is joining us tonight to talk about Freud's The Uncanny. I'm currently working on a research project that oftentimes gives me the feeling of the uncanny. I say to myself, gosh, this pattern, this discovery that I have just made is uncanny. But I couldn't really define what the uncanny was. So I went out and started poking around and found this essay, this little known essay that Freud had done on the uncanny. So and I've prepared a synopsis for us tonight that hopefully will generate a robust discussion. But before we begin, I guess I want to turn the mic over to you and intro- introduce yourself to the audience. We met via YouTube because I believe you found one of the poetry uh, analysis videos that I did years ago. And then I found your YouTube channel and noticed that you were doing all these wonderful audiobooks. She really has an incredible voice for it. And I said, I think this would be a good person to collaborate with. I don't know if you want to tell people about your channel or how you got into reading audiobooks or if you've ever done anything like this before, discussing literature or psychology, philosophy in podcast format. Why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Hello, my name is AnnaMarie Figueroa. I am a YouTube artist. I have originally aspired to read books, read articles, and different information on any different articles and databases that you guys would like me to cover on to be able to do any further explanation, or most importantly, just reading off of the text that's provided just to help assist further understanding. On my current YouTube channel, uh, I have I have myself reading out loud um, Shakespeare sonnets, as well as I also do work in Spanish, and I can speak another language. I can speak French, and I can read French text. Um, and however, you will find in this conversation this to be very decorated with how Sigmund Freud refers to the uncanny, and not only his original philosophical foundation on the fundamentals of his own psychology, but he also directs how this pertains itself into other cultures, and most importantly, how it is how this plays a significant role within his German um, background.
Sure. Yeah.
So yes.
Well, I have to say, what I love about your YouTube channel and what the little you've told about me about yourself and why you have taken such an interest in creating audiobooks is that you really have a passion to serve others by translating text into audio files. And I think that's what's so cool about you is how dedicated you are to your craft. You know, a, a lot of people don't understand how important people like yourself are for the promulgation of obscure texts and novels and really getting things out there into forms that people wouldn't normally consume. So I know you're just starting out, but I'm really proud of what you've done so far. And and so you all know, she's also done a recitation of Freud's The Uncanny. I don't know of anyone else who's ever done this, and I believe she's going to be putting that on her YouTube channel at some point or somewhere, and when she feels like it's ready to go. So before we get started in our synopsis, what did you enjoy reading Freud's The Uncanny? What did you think about it? What's your overall takeaway Are you a fan? Had you read Freud before? Is this your first introduction to Freud?
Yes.
Yes to what?
Yes, well, I am familiar with Sigmund Freud as we as we are mentioning in this segment. I'm already familiar with Sigmund Freud, and I'm already familiar with his works. However, I had not personally reviewed over one specifically that is to be able to read for others. Um, but I definitely am already familiar with him and his work, and most importantly, how he still to this day is prevalent into the main principles of psychological literature.
Well, I thought I was familiar with Freud, but I didn't realize how much he actually wrote. Uh, I had when I was younger, I believe I had read Civilization and its discontents and some stuff on dream interpretation. But right now, I'm working through Totem and Taboo, which I believe is mentioned in this article. So I'm almost done with that. There's a version of it on LibriVox for those that are interested. It's free, and there's a million others. It was so prolific. I can't say that I can't say I'm in complete agreement with him on which issues. I think actually after we get through tonight, I'll have to actually decide if I think his take on the uncanny is valid. It was kind of a stretch. I was a little bit sick this week to even get the synopsis of it done. But what did you think about this particular article? Did did this one do you, did this one resonate with you? Did you like it?
Yes, very much. Very much.
What did you like about it?
I like the most how he, well, you know, in its time, the what we find uncanny is what we find something that is unfamiliar and what is um, unrecognizable, especially at its first instant. And most importantly, how that fits along into our culture and our societal norms that to be able to create the continuing foundation that is the initial true reaction that needs to happen within your social environment. And and I this is talking, this covers on the mental attitude and the life that is distinguished as itself in the late 18th century um, and early in 19th century. But so when we find something uncanny that is that's putting it, I would say very modestly, that what we find something that's unfamiliar rather than even reacting out of towards its own context, anger. So
Well, I think we'll find that it's apparently unfamiliar. And maybe we should get into it may seem unfamiliar, but as Freud is going to point out, it's actually something that is already seated in the human mind and that we're intimately connected with.
yes,
But but why don't is it okay if I move on to the synopsis of our lesson?
yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm just going to read the lesson plan that I put together for our discussion. I didn't time it. This may take 10 minutes or so. So hopefully, you all don't get tired of me reading for a little bit. And then we'll bring AnnaMarie back into the conversation to discuss the larger themes of the text. So without further ado, let me just pull up the document here. Okay, so the text that I used, so you all can find it. I'll put it underneath the YouTube description box. I got it from an MIT.edu site. Um, and this article is hosted in a variety of different academic institution websites. You don't just have to use the MIT version. There might be multiple translations, but it's The Uncanny, and this was published in 1919. So, psychoanalysts rarely attend to aesthetical theory. Thus, when Freud does, it is to shine a light upon the neglected and nebulous uncanny. People say it is all that excites horror and dread. However, this is dissatisfactory. We must identify the defining traits that separate the uncanny from the fearful. To do so, Freud proposes 1. Trace the historical meaning of uncanny, and 2. Deduce what the uncanny is from a collection of instances. Both routes in Freud's estimation entail the conclusion that the uncanny is a subset of the terrifying connected to the familiar. How can the familiar be frighteningly uncanny, given that unheimlich, in English uncanny, is thought to equal its opposite, heimlich, in English familiar, native, belonging to home? Not everything unfamiliar is disorienting and scary. An extract from the German yields shades of meaning for heimlich. The ambiguous Heimlich contains 2 idea sets. The first, familiar, congenial. The second, concealed, kept out of sight. Typically, the first signification is employed with unheimlich, being the contrary. However, Freud summons Schelling for nuance, and I love this quote. Unheimlich is the name for everything that ought to have remained hidden and secret and has become visible. F.W.J. Schelling's Philosophy of Mythology. If the uncanny is the familiar, which ought to have remained hidden, then unheimlich evolves into a subspecies of its opposite. Freud, not totally convinced, proceeds with the investigation of uncanny episodes. Part 2. Freud believed Jentsch provided some good examples of the uncanny. 1. Animate beings in possession of a facsimile of life, and the reverse, inanimate objects becoming ensouled, i.e., wax figures, dolls, automatons. And 2. Epileptic seizures and insanity cases reveal mechanical processes beneath expected animation. Jentsch believes Hoffman best captured the uncanny sensation connected to automatons. Freud does not disagree, yet more may be learned about the uncanny from Hoffman's The Sandman. Freud refreshes our memory. He is a wicked man who comes when children won't go to bed and throws handfuls of sand in their eyes so that they jump out of their heads all bleeding. Then he puts the eyes in a sack and carries them off to the moon to feed his children. They sit up there in their nest, and their beaks are hooked like owls' beaks, and they use them to peck up naughty boys' and girls' eyes with. Freud proceeds to go through the fine details of Hoffman's Sandman, but we can skip that for the time being. On his view, the Sandman is uncanny due to the retained childhood fear of losing one's eyes, which is akin to castration. Think Oedipus blinding himself. The Sandman summons the dreadful castration complex. And so what is that again? Drawing from Wikipedia, in Freudian psychoanalysis, castration anxiety refers to an unconscious fear of penile loss originating during the phallic stage of psychosexual development and lasting a lifetime, according to Freud. When the infantile male becomes aware of differences between male and female genitalia, he assumes that the female's penis has been removed and becomes anxious that his penis will be cut off by his rival, the father figure, as punishment for desiring the mother figure. Can the castration complex be applied to other uncanny moments, such as the story's lifelike doll? I forgot to add this, but Freud will put this in there that the doll itself is interrupting the main character, Nathaniel's ability to consummate romantic and sexual relationships. So the doll is, in a way, he believes, not freaky because it's magically coming to life, but because it's interrupting his ability to procreate. Paradoxically, an animate doll is a juvenile wish fulfillment. Thus, in itself, it does not arouse fear. Freud intends to resolve this apparent contradiction in due time. I sort of did it for us already, but uh, we'll have more to say about automatons a little bit later. Freud, unfinished with Hoffman, explores the devil's elixir for uncanny themes traceable to infantile sources. Freud latches on to his use of telepathic doubles, the recurrence of similar situations, faces, traits, turns of fate, and names. Taking Otto Rank's lead, Freud endorses the idea that the double emanates from the impulse to preserve the soul. Once modern man has overcome his primitive mind, the double is a harbinger of death, persists as the censoring conscience, or even represents dreams crushed by reality. Freud isn't exactly sure why the double arouses the uncanny, so he focuses on the helplessness felt within dreamlike recurring scenarios. Uncanny recurring scenarios such as 1. Being lost in a high mountain forest, returning to the same landmark, unable to find the path. 2. In a dark, strange room, looking for the light switch and colliding over and over again with the same piece of furniture. The involuntary repetition causes an uncanny atmosphere where the inescapable is thrust upon us. 3. A man who repeatedly sees the number 62, thinking this may be the age he dies. Side note here, ironically, I believe it was Freud himself, as much as he claims to not experience the uncanny, who believed that he would die at 62 because he saw it in so many places. So we get a little bit of his personal biography in the uncanny. I learned that from, I believe, is a biography that I listened to preparing for this episode. For reading the works of Herring and then receiving multiple letters from men named Herring in different places, in different parts of the world. So Freud comes up with the principle of repetition compulsion to explain this. And I had to do a little bit further digging on this today because I didn't quite understand how it all fit together, but I think I do now. So from Wikipedia, the repetition compulsion is a psychological phenomenon in which a person repeats an event or its circumstances over and over again. This includes reenacting the event or putting oneself in situations where the event is likely to happen again. This reliving can also take the form of dreams in which memories and feelings of what happened are repeated and even hallucinated. Repetition compulsion can also be used to cover the repetition of behavior or life patterns more broadly, a key component in Freud's understanding of mental life. Repetition compulsion describes the pattern whereby people endlessly repeat patterns of behavior which were difficult or distressing in earlier life. So, what recalls the repetition compulsion equals the uncanny? Can this be stated more simply? Individuals with unconsciously repressed trauma are inclined to repeat it for a variety of reasons. One of the most popular theories being mastery. When we feel trapped in uncanny repetitious scenarios, that repetition compulsion associated with a deep wound is triggered. Freud amended the repetition compulsion principle throughout his life, and it's much more thoroughly developed in other works. Remembering, repeating, and working through, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Inhibition, Symptom, and Anxiety. Hopefully this satisfactorily elucidates the connection. And the reading on the uncanny, Freud assumes that we're already familiar with this because he's written about it so extensively elsewhere. And I would, just on the fly, that would be one of my critiques, is that understanding this uncanny paper requires some pre-reading. So it's not exactly obvious what his points are at times because he's assuming that his audience already knows what the castration complex is or what the repetition complex is. Next, Freud considers more uncanny episodes, such as obsessional neurotics with a purported presentiment towards the future or those who dread the evil eye. These examples reveal the dormant animistic universe, where the world is full of spirits and the overestimation of subjective mental processes. Each of us has been through the primitive animistic stage. Thus, the uncanny is that stirring of vestigial mental activity. Freud puts forward two considerations. One, these repressed emotional affects become uncanny morbid anxiety upon experiencing recurrence. Two, if the secret nature of the uncanny, then we understand why das Heimlich has evolved into its opposite, das Unheimlich. For the uncanny is nothing new being established in the mind. To recap and enumerate the factors that can turn something fearful into something uncanny. We have class 1 uncanny, which involves the surmounted animistic worldview. So we have 4 different categories of this first class that Freud gives us. And I've taken some liberties to sort this out a little bit. It could be arguable how with the examples that I've included here, but Freud himself says, look, these are not hard and fast distinctions. They're going to bleed into one another. So the class 1 involving the surmounted animistic worldview, the first is animism. So examples of that, we talked a little bit about this already. Individuals who may seem via spirit possession appear to have like a superpower, or people with epilepsy or madness who appear to be possessed by demons, or even practicing psychoanalysis itself can seem like a demonic superpower. 2, magic and witchcraft. This is when the distinction between imagination and reality is erased. And I'm thinking that the reason why automatons are uncanny is because it creates an uncertainty about whether or not something magical is going on here if we've entered back into the animistic universe.
Yes.
3, omnipotence of thoughts, very similar to magic and witchcraft, where there's a disproportionate amount of infantile psychic reality versus physical reality. So omnipotence of thoughts would be like cursing individuals and then, or affecting them with our glance and then having something terrible happen to them. 4, man's attitudes to death. Return of the dead instills fear that the deceased will carry us off with him. So it would seem he kind of drops the double thing, but I think that the double would go here, that the double is reminding us of our own desire for immortality that was part of the spirit world, that was a part of this animistic view that we supposedly were to transcend. And then we have the class 2 uncanny, which involves repressed infantile complexes, which we have covered more extensively with the Wikipedia quotes at the beginning. The one concerning involuntary repetition with the repressed infantile complex. And 6, the castration complex. And this it's not just the story with losing your eyes in the Sandman, but other things like dismembered body parts which move. Why we find things like, was it Thing, the hand on the Addams Family, why it was creepy?
Yes.
Yeah. So, part 3, Freud acknowledges that he may not have laid out a perfect argument. The uncanny may be A, something hidden, B, that is familiar, C, that has undergone repression, D, emerged from repression. Dissatisfied, Freud acknowledges not everything that fulfills the condition is uncanny, and uncanny episodes may exist which contradict this condition. Instances which contradict the condition largely come from fiction. Fiction blatantly and sometimes subtly adopts the animistic worldview. Thus, many things not uncanny in fiction would be uncanny in real life. The animistic view also provides fiction infinite resources to invent the uncanny feeling, so long as the setting mirrors physical reality, thus producing cases that defy the conditions set forth by Freud. If the scope is limited to those things in real life, they can be much more easily conditioned. However, the uncanny will appear on fewer occasions. Freud is confident it will fit with the solution, and all can be traced back to something familiar being repressed. Unlike our primitive forefathers, we have surmounted animistic thinking, but we are not certain about our new beliefs, and the old ones endure awaiting confirmation. When something in real life supports the discarded, we sense the uncanny and exclaim, "So X is true." One who has completely eradicated the animistic worldview will not feel the uncanny. The whole matter is just testing material reality. So nothing to see here, no matter how many coincidences stack up. Freud says things are different when the uncanny arises from repressed infantile complexes, but these are rare. Most instances of the uncanny belong to the first group. However, the two classes of uncanny are not always clearly distinguishable, given that primitive beliefs are often founded upon infantile complexes. It should be noted the class of uncanny repressed complexes is just as potent in fiction as in real life, unlike the uncanny class that issues forth from our surmounted animistic view. If the setting is too fantastical, that sense of the uncanny dissipates. All right, so I am done. That is my synopsis of Freud's The Uncanny. And in order to distill that down to 3.5 pages, I had to cut out some things that other individuals would find very important. And I'm going to let my co-host enter in here again. Um, we can talk about so many different things. We can talk about, do we agree with Freud? Does Freud make sense? Is Freud on the right track? Do you do you do you have personal experiences of the uncanny that possibly wouldn't be covered in Freud's condition? Or maybe if we thought about them, we could make them fit into Freud's condition. Um, and then there's all the things that like I didn't talk about. We spoke off camera earlier. Uh, you have a great deal more linguistic expertise than I do. I believe you speak 3 languages,
Oh,
and
yes, thank you.
yeah, and so Freud goes through all these different languages, looking at the uncanny in all those different languages. I find it, the German seems to give us the most to work with. So I don't know. Where do you want to take the conversation? Where should we go first? I'll let you lead.
Okay. Yes. Um, well, I would like to clarify that his his subject on what we find as uncanny or unheimlich, um, that something that is unfamiliar to what is compared to something that is close to being completely fearful, which is something that we need to be concerned of, is meant to explain through the level of proper psychoanalytic language and proper psychoanalytic approach to be able to continue on to how we can be able to, through step by step, how we can be able to talk through such a patient, that we see how far this can be extremely revert back to into the infantile and
Right.
senses, to where that you can be able to detect when it becomes almost premature in a person that's, and have how that's exposed.
So do you believe what he has to say about how at least one class of the uncanny is rooted in the infantile complex? Like whether it be a castration complex or the repetition complex. Did that resonate with you?
Repetition, um, all of, well, everything that he's covered that goes against um, everything that he's covered in that you have separated, that is the original class one of the uncanny, um, goes against the uh, pre-known forms of the established religion, what separates religion from man, and how it separates into our what how it separates into our world as what we could follow. And stemming apart from that, and how we can go further into um, diving deep into the culture and how far that it goes in towards man's attitude towards death, how it goes into animism, and most importantly, how far it goes into the uh, creation and process of man.
Uh,
I would like to go further into it when once talking towards the repressed infantile complex. I'm talking about mostly of the involuntary repetition of discovery, of the initial discovery, and how our reaction and approach to discovery is, and that discovery is of I am man, I am this human, I have this corpse that is the spectre of life, the specter of life, that is to speculate or to spectate you and myself, and how we are together and we talk through as um, man in total comprehension. So I think that with when it comes to the repressed infantile complexes, that just goes back to the initial fear of um, reverse of self and reverse of myself, and what this morally means to me, that has had me to be eradicated thus in itself, which goes back to memory, memory repression, and you get the psychosomatic loops, or possibly psychotic loops, and that definitely goes far into um, how it means to lose yourself, and to lose yourself physically, and then you have to think about the initial punishments that separated what is the culture of such man. So I think that that's very interesting, how much Sigmund Freud had to separate himself as, okay, I am saying this for our culture and our social norm that needs to be governed, and how it's being governed and how it's being covered today. And so this goes into um, the 1800s and late 1800s and early 1900s for how this distinguished us as gentlemen.
yeah, I think you raised some very interesting points here. I didn't think to bring religion into it, but the obvious implication of all this, right, is that the further and further away you are from a religious worldview, not just an animistic worldview, which I think would probably be a subset of the animistic worldview of which Freud speaks of. I think the animistic worldview is just a catch-all for, the 95% of the world's population that is spiritual on some level. That you can subtract this uncanny feeling the more you jettison the religious worldview. I think an interesting question we have to ask ourselves: do we want to do that?
Hmm.
Like, is the feeling of the uncanny so terrible that it justifies getting rid of religious paradigms? I know it's not really the argument that he's making. He's just making an observation that once you have overcome animistic worldview, that you will not experience the uncanny as much. That's why he's saying, "Oh, I don't experience it very much because I'm this very enlightened uh, atheist former Jew." Like, I don't know. I haven't revealed this to you, but like I'm a very religious person. Like I
Okay.
identify as a Christian, and I hope that's okay. But
Yes.
and 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 yeah, I experience the uncanny a great deal more now
Hmm.
as a Christian. but I don't find it something so terrible that it like makes my life worse. In fact, I actually enjoy how uncanny experiences sort of enrich my life. I find life more meaningful as a
Yes.
result of having I have uncanny experiences all the time.
Yes.
In fact, this book that I'm working on is largely driven by all the uncanny experiences that I've been having over the past 4 or 5 years.
Yes.
But maybe Freud would say like this is a cope, right? This is your inability to adjust to the external reality that is meaningless, and so you have to fill it with all these episodes of the uncanny in order to have like something to live for. Of course, this is the guy who's like, takes great pleasure in reading these grotesque Hoffman stories about children getting their eyes plucked out. So I,
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, do you personally experience the uncanny? I mean, do you mind if I ask or?
Yes, but before
Oh,
express my personal experiences with the uncanny, I'd like to go over how Sigmund Freud is basing this mostly off of his German culture and the German heritage that is separate. Most of German heritage has separated itself from the known religious hotspots that created um, the separation of borders, that is Italy, France, Spain, and even somewhat England. I think that with with German heritage, they focus a lot of the math, the sciences, a little bit more. They talk through about the original culture from how it descended from the UK and so forth. Um, and so they talk a little bit more about how they express themselves with through what's witnessed in perception and how they handle all of that, all of what is perceived and all the evidentiary, um, all of the science that is evident in their time versus and how they control.
well, I'll say this. I'll say this. You can't test Freud's theories really. So,
Yes, of
so like
course.
Freud, Freud, like it's not like this is like I shouldn't say this. I'm not some expert in psychology, but this theory on the uncanny, it's a little bit you'd have to do a lot of scientific design to get some like observable results about what exactly is going on here because something that I find uncanny, you may not find uncanny. It may vary greatly between individuals. And even if you could establish some sort of baseline, you know, we have to ask ourselves if that's really scientific. So the question where I would put to you here is Freud doing science or is Freud kind of pontificating about some of his ideas? Like, is he just kind of waxing philosophically? Because as enlightened and scientific as he may want to position himself to be, he's not exactly doing psychology that can be replicated in the lab. It's more of he's sort of doing the experimentation on his own soul, if he even believes in that, which he doesn't. But you know what I'm saying.
Yes, yes. He has to. Well, he has to. First, he has to witness what's happening. Then he has to talk to the patients. Then he has to talk through how far this goes into their background and their history and what repeats. How far he noticed a repetition of man and the culture of man, and then most importantly, how it plays onto him. And then he has to consider his entire culture that separates him, and then and language. So I find that I think he took it, and I think he took it in a very I would say he definitely took it in a fashionable way that is towards his own name.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're not wrong to point out like all the things that are going on at this time in Germany, right? Because it is this obsession with the scientific breakdown of man. Scientific, I'm using air quotes here,
Yes,
right? Like, that gives rise to the idea of like the perfectibility of man. and the perfectibility of the human race. And this is where we get ideas like, you know, eugenics and all the things that happened as a result of the Nazi regime during the Second World War. Now, I'm not trying to pin it on Freud, but um, you can see how all of these things in their own way lead up to step by step uh, a eugenics program.
Yes.
You know, I mean, you're ultimately going to be. I mean, you're ultimately in this sort of conversation. You're talking about some superior men, which I guess, like if further down, the ideas of Nietzsche are going to get involved at some point, but some superior men that are able to overcome the the animistic worldview, and that sounds a lot like the idea of the Ubermensch that can
Yes.
transcend, that Nietzsche talks about, whether it's in uh, Das Fix Zarathustra, which is something I need to revisit as well, and the genealogy of morals. An interesting find that I discovered while putting this seminar together is that Carl Jung. So many people know that Freud, one of his disciples was Jung, and Jung actually, I found this out, flirted with Nazism in like the early 30s. And while he was doing that, he was teaching a class on Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. And I believe in like the late 80s,
Mm-hmm.
the lecture notes for that class came out, and you can get them now. Um, so I'm very interested to see how like Jung interpreted Nietzsche, applied his archetypes to it. So
Oh,
that
awesome.
I had no idea that this existed. And I've done a fair amount of research on Nietzsche and Jung throughout the years, and to know that there's a book about both of them together and that Jung was commentating on Nietzsche is absolutely insane. I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to do some further digging. I mean, I'm sure Freud knew his Nietzsche. So I'd have to, but I'm not sure how much Freud was in agreement with Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so I interrupted you.
Oh, no, you did not. You did not. You did. You're perfectly fine.
Okay. Well, what did you think about, I mean, what do we think about his system in general? Like,
Um,
do we, like, are we buying this? Like, that,
yes, I think that
do you think he got it
this,
right?
well, I mean, this is covering himself and how he's viewed, how much we've come towards ourselves to identify ourselves as educated men of uh, gentlemen, educated gentlemen, because it was around the 1700s and the 1700s and the 1800s that the 1700s mostly, that the idea of a university is prevalent, to where we become men that are educated and experienced in certain fields, and he's taking it from what we've experienced upon the major discovery of man and how far we separated ourselves into the social norms that is governed. And I have to say that Sigmund Freud definitely touches on the perfect perception as an outside observer of man, and I think that it's beautiful that he was German for this. That's what I would say specifically, and I say specifically German just because of how far this it covers into the culture of um, magic and how we separate ourselves from the Christian religion and how we see ourselves as our individuals of our own thoughts and how we guide ourselves from after death and towards death. And most importantly, I'd like to go over, if you look on page 3, if and you see the foreign translations that he has here. He has in total 5 translations, 2 that are seem to describe themselves into the content, or seem to content themselves with words which we would describe as circumlocutions, circumlocutions, locutions. I'm sorry,
Circumlocutions?
circumlocutions. Thank you very much. Which was repetitive means of forward thought, and then how it goes straight into 2 other languages that go deep into the a religious bias perception. But when you go to the first 5 languages, he talks about how this separates itself from the actual description of what is considered strange and foreign, or into something that we don't know, that is something that is unlike what we've known, or that is something that goes against our initial household, and against our initial home, which das Haus is the house for what we need to recognize in today, which makes Sigmund Freud.
Yeah. So, one of the things that got me, let me see if I can try to express this properly. One of the things that got me is that if we can overcome the animistic worldview and we can properly deal with the trauma that we may have as the result of the castration complex or the repetition complex, we can reduce the feeling of the uncanny.
Yes.
But what's interesting to me is that you could have all this evidence of the uncanny mounting up before you of things that are a part of the animistic worldview, and you're going to be constantly dismissing them, at least if they're a part of the class 1, as coincidences and things not worth investigating. Let me give you an example. Okay, here's an example of something uncanny. Okay, so here's a little pop history question. So if I asked you what happened on November 22nd, 1963, you would tell me what?
Well, 1963 would be somewhere around the early civil rights movement.
I won't leave you to twist on the vine here, but it was the day that JFK was killed.
That JFK was. Oh, okay.
That's
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah, yes, that sounds exactly right towards my natural memory.
All right. So November 22nd, 1963 is the day that JFK died. Well, very few people know that Aldous Huxley, the writer of Brave New World, okay, and The Doors of Perception, and many people believe we are living in the Brave New World now, okay, for a variety of reasons.
Ah, yes, this world's beautiful.
Yeah. But he died the same day, the same year as JFK. And it doesn't end there. C.S. Lewis, who was also a major thinker during this time, dies the same day, the same year. So on the same day, the world lost JFK, Aldous Huxley, and C.S. Lewis. Now, we don't usually talk about that because all anyone remembers is that JFK died that day. That's, if you think about that, those are some big personalities to all die on the same day. And you go, oh, well, that's just a coincidence. Or here's another example. So, three of the first five American presidents all died on July 4th. So, um,
Um,
Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, uh, is it John Adams and James Monroe? Let me just look it up real quick. Uh, let's see. Three three of five presidents died on July 4th. Yeah. So John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Monroe died on July 4th, the Independence Day anniversary. So uh, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, within hours of each other. And then James Monroe, 5 years later, died on July 4th, 1831. So 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, and 55 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. So you have the possibility of three of the five first presidents, three of the five founding fathers dying on the same day that our country's independence was established. The statistical possibility of that is very, very low. So, so what's going on here? Like, is this, you have to say that that is like just a coincidence that gives rise to the feeling of the uncanny, that there's like some sense of like some sort of unfolding destiny to the world that is being organized by something, you know, birthdays, death days, whatever, right? Or or you just look at it and just go, "Oh man, like things just happen." And
I
I think
definitely. Go ahead.
it seems irresponsible. Like, and those are just, I could give like other examples all day long, like
Yes.
April 15th, like the Titanic sinks on April 15th. Uh, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated on April 15th. Um, IRS Day is April 15th. There's a bunch of other things. But what I'm trying to say here is you start to have things mount up like this that seem to go beyond statistical probability. And so the question becomes, are you actually doing good research and good science if you start to ignore these things that mount up because you're dismissing them as being in touch with a barbaric sense of the uncanny? And I think what has happened in a lot of modern intellectualism is that we have blinded ourselves to actually valuable data that is screaming out, trying to get to our attention. And
Yes.
Freud might be slightly responsible for that. So I just want to point that out. But saying things like that makes me look a little wacky. But it
Not at all. Not at all. I mean,
well, maybe not to you, but to
no.
respectable academics, it does.
Well, well, okay. Then you have to pay attention to how numbers correlate in order for for the statistics for the statistical average to be able to hold a meaning of standard. You get what I'm saying? Numbers have to play an important role within your within your life to what you and how you make the choices and how you make the decisions on and how this goes into your life altering states and how anything can be able to respond and how life responds. If But at the same time, I definitely say stay safe and when it comes to numbers, don't give it the accurate meaning over yourself and your whole world in that moment. I always say to just stand guarded and just, uh, make the number 3. It doesn't have to be something of an odd number or something that is put into meaning of something in odd context. Sometimes it might mean that you have one too many, or maybe, you're one too extra, which goes into something that could be reversed back to zero, which it could be something fatal. It's just I believe that there is it's there is some wariness that you have to be considerate of no matter what, and that you can't run away from. But I find it comforting that I can have a comrade and to tell me, well, while that may seem uncanny, please go ahead and have a drink and calm yourself down, and maybe we can be able to give this a whole another meaning. You know?
Yeah, I'm not. I will not speculate here what I think all those death days
Oh,
mean. I I
yes.
uh I actually I don't really know, and I can't really prove it. I have a theory, but it it will probably remain untestable.
Hmm.
So, um, well, we've gone for quite a bit. Uh, is there anything else that you wanted to cover in our session?
Yes. I would really love to ask, how did you feel when you were reading how the Sandman extracted eyes from the children to be able to, or I'm sorry, how he extracted the eyes to be able to feed towards his children. How did you find that that folk tales and the such of the grim fairy tales and the folk tales that are as such, especially that are constituted within the culture that we give to each other as to what to fear. How did you feel about that story of the Sandman in
Well,
particular, and when you first read it, how did you like that?
well, I have complex feelings about the Sandman because
Okay.
a in our culture, the Sandman story has been deeply watered down and made to be something to embrace, right? You know the
Yes.
song, Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. And like you know the old song, right? Make him
Yes.
the cutest that I've ever seen. So they're singing about this like demonic figure, right? And everybody's going around singing about the Sandman because of this really catchy song. That's freaking uncanny. I grew
Oh.
up as a I grew up as a little I grew up as a little child hearing the Sandman song like on Family Ties and other places and thinking it was just like this harmless thing, right?
Yes.
Meanwhile, it's like this archaic like demonic force. Secondly, I personally believe that the Sandman story has been used to transform our understanding of reality itself. Now, I can't say
Yes.
too much without getting myself into trouble, but think about it, right? So, what does the Sandman do? He
Uh,
throws sand into the eyes of the children to make them go to sleep, and and bloodies their eyes, right? So, so that's like a metaphor, right, for people who cannot see reality that's presented before them. And I personally believe we have an epidemic where people cannot properly see reality.
yes.
Okay. Now, unfortunately, I'll get in trouble if I share my views on that. Also, I think it's very important to think about where does the Sandman take the eyes of the children? Takes the takes the eyes to the moon. And
Oh.
the moon is made of sand,
Mm-hmm.
dust. So I'll just leave it at that and
Mm-hmm.
I'll let people make their own inferences. Has the Sandman thrown dust in your eyes? All our eyes? Does that story, does that story, what was that story employed for the
Well,
purpose of putting us asleep?
I would say that um, I have ventured from the deepest, from the deepest space of resonance that is, well, what I would have said, I would say after sleep. Once I've arisen, I would say that I have experienced a resurrection of self after death into what I now can say I've traveled back towards my beginning time, and unfortunately, I have been scathed by the moon dust.
We should, we need to talk more. We need to talk more about the moon dust.
Yes,
Maybe
thank
not
you.
here, but maybe
The wizard,
offline.
the howling winds of the blizzards of the moon.
Uh,
Yes,
uh, okay. All right. We'll talk about that sometime.
thank you.
Do you know what I know? I think you might know what I know.
What's that?
Well, I can't say it here. We'll have to do it offline.
Okay. Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Um, were there any other questions you wanted to ask?
Um, no, I think that's it. I let me check back over my notes. Um, I really like that I really like, and I underlined this, and this is on page 3. If you want to refer back, it's on the same page. But it's we can only say what is novel can become frightening and uncanny. Some new things are frightening, but not by any means at all. Something has to be added to what is novel and unfamiliar to make it uncanny. So I would like to express that while things may seem drastic and may seem fearful into what can repeat into your present day, if you take if you take it and take the novel, I'm sorry, if you take that and then you just take into what is added into what creates into that novel, if you just take it out and you and understand that, wow, that felt unfamiliar, that didn't feel too great, um, I would like to it you're not going to be frightened in the long run. It's not anything to um, feel that it needs further investigation into where it would circulate into a dangerous investigation of self and ultimately lead to um, any devastating circumstances, because I think that the repetition starts to unravels itself, and and the universe you know gets changes on its own willingly. So I'd like to say that in a far stretch way, but back to Sigmund Freud. Like I said, it's don't give it any further fear of any further fear to be able to restrain it from any further compulsion, future compulsion.
Are you are you by chance a Stanley Kubrick fan?
I've never heard of him. I'm sorry.
Well, he's one of the greatest filmmakers that uh, you probably have seen one or two of his movies, but he like The Shining or 2001: Space
Oh,
Odyssey
yes.
or Eyes Wide Shut or something like that.
Yes.
His movies have a lot of the uncanny in them, and for this research project, I need to see them all again, and there's all there's all this stuff with Kubrick that I'm interested in. In fact, it's really what motivated this whole book idea. But have you seen The Shining, where Scatman tells Danny, he's like, because Danny is seeing all these things that are terrifying and frightening and uncanny because he has The Shining, and Scatman Carruthers just tells him, he's like, they're just pictures in a book, just pictures in the book.
Yes.
It's not real. Don't let it get you.
Yes. Yes,
That's
definitely.
a pretty profound moment. So
Definitely. Yes. Do you have any other questions for me, Doctor?
I think we're good. I think we're good. I want to thank you so much for this opportunity to help get my mind around the uncanny and prepare this little bit of an excerpt for my book. It's been wonderful having this exchange of ideas with you, and perhaps we can do this again in the future.
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
And right before we leave, may I say one more? May I
Sure.
say?
Sure.
I like how he says on page 17. I like how he says, if you go down, he says, as soon as something actually happens in our lives which seem to support the old discarded beliefs, we get a feeling of the uncanny. And I took that initial sentence as will support the old discarded beliefs. That I translated that into tradition.
Hmm.
Um, old discarded beliefs, we get a feeling of the uncanny, which gives the feeling of anybody that goes against tradition a new meaning, which that's what I base most of my interpretation on, the uncanny, which is social tradition and social uh, and how that goes into social government
Well,
and socialism.
tradition's an interesting thing. You know,
Yes,
at the time that Freud is writing, he's probably dealing with a world that is still very magical and spiritual to even though he's running with the intelligentsia, the average person is still probably very pious and still and you know believing in a world filled with spirits. Now we have traditions that are different because we've gone under so much scientific perfection. It's actually very the tradition now is to not see anything wonderful about life at all, that it is just all sort of a chaotic tumbling of events, that there is not some sort of magisterial hand sort of guiding history. So tradition can kind of change. And this is the point that I'm trying to critique Freud a little bit, is that if you adopt this new tradition of reductionistic materialism, and if something truly is occurring that is crying out for explanation, that is defying the established scientific materialism, you're going to miss it if you're too embroiled in kind of a technocratic or a scientific um, totalitarianism. So
yes,
that's my
yes.
big critique of Freud.
Which
I,
I personally believe, as long as there is a systematic way of that traditions are being honored, I can't speak for anything of my opinion towards the future or any political stance. But I definitely agree with you, Doctor.
well,
But
that
I
makes that you're the first.
thank you. Um, yes, I like how he says, and it is as though we are making a judgment, something like this. So after all, it is true that one can kill a person by merely desiring his death, or then the dead to do continue to live and appear before our eyes on the scenes of their former activities, and so on. And then he says, and conversely, he who has completely and finally dispelled animistic beliefs in himself will be insensible to this type of uncanny.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's page 17. Please
yeah,
read back over that quote
yeah.
um, and just keep reading that and just think about how far that it goes um, into ourselves. So that's all I have to say.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity. And if you have any further questions, please let me know.
All right. Well, I will be in touch, and I want to thank our audience for listening. Um, I will try to have this up and edited as soon as I get your audio files. And truthfully, I'm probably going to go to bed early tonight, so probably be Monday or Tuesday before I have this up on the Noetic YouTube channel. The Noetic app, if you go to noetic.app, we have so many things happening over there in terms of new content. Um, and we've just released a new version of that. Uh, so I hope that you take advantage of all those educational resources that we have over there.
Of course.
And yeah, that'll bring this to an end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.